Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Going to start on time. Mazel tov, Shechianu. What do you know? There's lots of good stuff happening here at the Conejo Jewish Academy. You have catalogs in front of you. There's the Monopoly series, what's called Crimes and Misdemeanors or something like that. Something like that happening with Rabbi Brisky. I know it's in your catalog. Crimes and Punishments, okay. Crimes and Misdemeanors is the movie with Woody Allen, right? Okay. Close enough. As well as a lot of other good classes, lectures happening. Take a look at your catalog. Tonight, we have a very serious topic. The Holocaust, World War II, the worst atrocities, Jewish history. And I think it's safe to say that as Jews, anytime we come across a story that has an uplifting message, we got him, we fooled them, it brings us a small bit of solace, if you will. I don't know about you, anytime I attend a Holocaust lecture or I speak to a survivor, and as I'm panning the room right now, it's hard to tell, but an educated guess would tell me that most of you were probably born after the Holocaust. Well, don't have to give away your age, it's okay. Except for my dear friend Isabel Schneer, who is sitting here, who together with her husband survived the Holocaust and witnessed really humanity at its very, very worst. And anytime I listen to Isabel speak or read a Holocaust book, I think I walk away with more questions than I have answers, because it's just impossible to understand how these people survived, how they lived, spirit, no warmth, no food, no family, and just to make heads and tails out of their stories is so difficult for me. And I'm guessing that many of you probably share that same difficulty in understanding how these people managed to survive. So tonight, hopefully, we'll have an uplifting story, if we can say that. Give us a little bit of a different look into some of the things that took place towards the end of the Holocaust. I learned tonight that Max Wallace is a fellow Montrealer. And that's wonderful. Anybody from Montreal gets carte blanche over here. He's a Holocaust historian. His book, which is on sale in the lobby, just recently won the Canadian Jewish Literature Award for Holocaust Literature. Also was a finalist in the 2018 BBC Taylor Prize. It's called In the Name of Humanity, The Secret Deal to End the Holocaust. I don't need to tell you the promo, you read it, and that's why you're here. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome warmly Mr. Max Wallace.
Thank you. Tonight's the first stop on my tour, and I have to say I was lured to Southern California with a promise of sunshine and warmth. And I'm from Canada, and even I can say it's freezing. So, here I am. You notice I'm wearing a kippah. Some of you are wearing kippahs. It's not often that I wear a kippah, because I'm a very proud Jew, but a very secular one. I've hardly worn a kippah since my bar mitzvah. And so that makes it all the stranger that I've just spent 17 years writing this book, most of that time immersed in the world of the ultra-Orthodox. So I'll give you a little background on how that happened. Unlikely turn of events. I was interviewing... I'm from Montreal. I'm originally from the States, but I grew up in Montreal, and I was working for Steven Spielberg's Shoah project, interviewing Holocaust survivors. And of course, every week, the same tales of despair. You know the stories. And it's pretty grim. And then one day I heard a story about a survivor with a very different story to tell. So I traveled to Toronto, where I met a man named Herman Landau. Herman was a Belgian Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Jew who had survived the Holocaust after he was smuggled into Switzerland by his cousin, a woman named Resha Sternbach, who becomes the hero of this story, the heroine. So Resha Sternbach was born Resha Rottenberg. Her father, Mordecai Rottenberg, was the chief rabbi, the chief Orthodox rabbi, ultra-Orthodox, Hasidic rabbi in Antwerp. So she was sort of born into ultra-Orthodox royalty. Her father was one of the founders of the Agadat Israel. And Resha in the 20s meets a man, a Swiss man, named Isaac Sternbach. And she ends up marrying Isaac and moving to Switzerland. Isaac was also very Orthodox Jew. And so Resha settles in to Swiss life. And at first she's just an ordinary Swiss housewife. And then Hitler comes to power in 1933, next door in Germany. But Hitler's rise, the rise of the Nazis next door, just a stone's throw away from where she was living in St. Gallen, it barely registered a ripple in the life of the Sternbach household and most Swiss households at the time. They didn't pay much attention to him. They knew he didn't like the Jews. And then suddenly there became a trickle of German Jews fleeing the Reich, mostly political activists, social democrats, communists. And that changes around the time of the Anschluss in Austria. Suddenly, the Jews in Austria realize they're not safe. And then comes Kristallnacht, the pogroms in 1938, and the trickle changes to a deluge. And suddenly the Jews of the Reich are desperate to flee. But by that time, nobody would take them. As you know, country after country closed their doors on the Jews fleeing the Reich. The United States, Roosevelt was sort of caught between the isolationist movement led by Charles Lindbergh under the banner America First. And the Jews had nowhere to go. So Resha, suddenly, almost overnight, especially after Kristallnacht, transforms from this ordinary Jewish housewife to a heroine of rescue, practically overnight. So Isaac Sternbach was quite affluent. He had an embroidery factory. They had some money. So Resha takes the money and establishes, on her own, she establishes an underground network. So by day, she would race from town to town establishing safe houses for the Jews being smuggled into Switzerland. At night, she would go to the border of Austria-Germany, sometimes with a motorcycle and sidecar, sometimes with a truck, and a thermos of coffee. And she would smuggle the Jews over the border, through the forests, and ensconce them in these safe houses that she'd set up all over the country. Then the safe houses filled up, and when that happened, she would stick them in her own apartment. And so, sometimes 20, 30 at a time, sleeping on the floors. And so Resha had first you have to picture Resha Sternbach. You can all picture the men, the ultra-Orthodox men, the Haredi men, with their beards and their black garments. But Resha, being a woman, in those days, today the ultra-Orthodox women often will shave their heads out of religious obligation or tradition. In those days, they were more likely to wear some sort of head covering. Resha fashioned herself a very distinctive head covering, which she described as a turban, which wouldn't have been out of place on the streets of Paris. She actually enjoyed going to Paris to see the fashion shows. So this would actually hold her in good stead because, the men were very distinct in their appearance. But she, with her fashionable turban, could more easily sort of navigate the Gentile world. And she did. She had all kinds of Gentile helpers, farmers, truckers. And the most important was a man named Paul Gruninger, who today is sometimes known as the Swiss Schindler. He was the police captain of St. Gallen, where she lived. And so Resha would smuggle the Jews over the border. Gruninger would help normalize them. He would forge papers to authorize their entry into the country. So this goes on. We don't know how many people she saved before the war, but it's definitely in the thousands. Some of them are still alive. And this suddenly comes to a halt in May 1939. The war hasn't started yet. But in May 1939, Paul Gruninger, the police captain, is arrested and fired from his job by the Swiss authorities for his role in smuggling Jews. At the same day, Resha Sternbach is arrested for a variety of crimes and charges. So this sort of puts an end for a while to her underground operation, needless to say. She spends the next more than a year and a half, preparing for her trial. And not much happens in the interval except that Hitler invades Poland, the war starts, things get more dire. So this goes on. Resha is preparing for her trial. Her phones are being tapped. She's being closely watched by the Swiss authorities. They don't want to anger the Germans. The Swiss are desperately afraid that Germany is going to invade Switzerland and threaten their neutrality. So Resha is a threat to this. So things go on. In Russia and the Soviet Union, the Einsatzgruppen are slaughtering Jews. Beginning in 1940, 1 million Jews are murdered by the Germans. But the final solution hasn't officially began. The Nazis haven't formally decided they're going to extinguish the remaining Jews of Europe. And then that happens, but the world is unaware. Nobody's talking about it. Nobody seems to know. And then a man named Gerhard Riegner of the World Jewish Congress, discovers from sources that the final solution is underway, and he sends a cable to the West, to New York. But the White House asks him to sit on it, to suppress it, until the contents could be verified. Meanwhile, also in Switzerland, the Sternbachs have heard of what's happening in Warsaw. The Germans have erected a ghetto. And they hear that the Jews in Warsaw are being treated very badly. Resha is very well connected through her father's connections in Agadat Israel. So she has this underground network. So she resumes her operation. She wants to do something for the Jews of the Warsaw ghetto. So she sends packages with saccharin, with food, with medicine, sometimes religious supplies. And that goes on. The plight of the Warsaw Jews is slowly trickled out. People know that they're not doing very well. But then one day the Sternbachs receive a cable from the Warsaw ghetto, from one of their sources, in a sort of rudimentary Hebrew code. And the cable informs them that the Nazis plan to liquidate the ghetto and to exterminate the remaining Jews of Europe by the end of the year, in 1942. So suddenly, Resha resumes. She knows she's compelled to resume her rescue work. And the Sternbachs send a cable, which today is known as the Sternbach cable, to the rabbis in New York. So they have very close contacts with the Orthodox rabbis in New York. And they tell the rabbis that about this diabolical Nazi plan to murder all the remaining Jews, and they ask the rabbis to spread the word. They should, lift heaven and earth to tell the world what's going on. Tell Einstein. Tell Felix Frankfurter, the Roosevelt's Jewish Supreme Court justice. Tell Roosevelt himself. Tell Eleanor Roosevelt. Tell Thomas Mann, the great German novelist. So they do this. The word is spread. The White House is still sitting on the original cable. So the Sternbuck cable becomes the first sort of verified communication of the final solution. So Thomas Mann, one of the recipients of their message, goes on the radio, goes on the BBC, broadcasts a message that the Germans are murdering Jews with poison gas. And Frank, sitting in the annex that she writes about, she writes in her diary that she's sitting there listening to the radio, and she hears this 2 weeks after this Thomas Mann message. She writes in her diary that on the BBC we hear that the Germans are want to murder all the Jews with poison gas. So the news is getting out for anybody who wants to listen. So the leader at this time of the Jewish community, the American Jewish community, probably the world Jewish community, the most prominent Jew, is a Reform rabbi named Stephen Wise. Stephen Wise was a very effective anti-Nazi from almost the week that Hitler took power. Stephen Wise mobilized the American, not just the American Jewish community, but Americans in general, to let them know what kind of monster Hitler is. So he's very effective in the pre-war period. And Wise is a Zionist leader. Most American Jews, most world Jews are not Zionists at this time, but Wise is a prominent Zionist leader, but he has respect from most Jewish factions. So Wise considers himself sort of a buddy of Roosevelt. You have to remember that at this time, the American Jewish community revered Roosevelt. Roosevelt was considered a friend to the Jews, the first friend that the Jews ever had in the White House. He appointed a Jewish cabinet member. He appointed a Jewish Supreme Court justice. He had Jewish advisors around him. He was beloved by the Jewish community. Probably certainly in New York, the majority of Jews had a portrait of Roosevelt on their wall. That's how beloved he was at this time. So Stephen Wise considers himself a friend, right? Going through the correspondence between them. And, you're supposed to address the President of the United States as Mr. President. Everybody calls the President Mr. President. Stephen Wise, in these letters, calls him chief or boss. That's how close he is, or thinks he is, to Roosevelt. So he trusts Roosevelt implicitly. And Roosevelt, he immediately goes to Roosevelt, or Chief, you have to do something for our people. Our people are being slaughtered. You have to do something to save the Jews. And Roosevelt reassures him immediately. Roosevelt assures him that the United States is absolutely committed to stopping Hitler and to stopping the slaughter and to saving the Jews. And Wise takes his word for it. Wise trusts him, tells all the other Jewish leaders that the president has our backs. So, meanwhile, there's a lot of there's sort of an urban legend today that the world knew about the Holocaust and didn't do anything about it. And the news was getting out and the world ignored it. That's true and not true. So you have to remember that only a couple of decades before, during World War I, there was something called, which today we call atrocity propaganda, where the British press, the American press as well, but especially the British, portrayed the Germans as these bloodthirsty monsters, the evil Hun. And there were stories that the Hun was hanging priests by the church bells and boiling babies alive and making soap out of them. So within months of the end of World War I, people learned that this was all propaganda. It was completely untrue, and that this was just a lie designed to discredit the Germans. So then you start hearing the same type of stories 22 years later, and most people don't believe them. Except at the White House summoned Stephen Wise and informs him that they've verified. The final solution is genuine. There's verified evidence, and Hitler plans to murder all the remaining Jews. So the world, the United States, mostly blissfully unaware or willful ignorance, but the White House knew. The Allied powers knew what was going on. So this continues, and the stories become worse. And by the time that the first news, by the time the Sternbucks sent their first cable, there were already almost 2 to 3 million Jews had already been murdered by the Nazis. But now there's evidence. And the Jews assume. So Roosevelt has told the Jews that Hitler will be stopped with the greatest military force ever assembled. And that's the key. We have to stop him militarily. And that's what's going to help your people. So they believe it. But the stories keep getting worse. And 2 million, 3 million, 4 million Jews have been murdered. And the Jews are looking on, saying, what's happening? The Americans promised us they had our back. Roosevelt was supposed to help us, but nothing is being done. And so Wise still keeps the hordes at bay. He tells them, don't worry, Roosevelt is, we have to win the war. That's the only way we're going to stop Hitler. That's the only way we're going to stop this Holocaust. And they're restless. The Jewish community is restless, but they trust him. They trust Roosevelt. So then what emerges is 2 smaller factions that are not willing to just sit by and allow this to happen. And so on the one side you have there's a very militant group of Zionists led by a man named Peter Bergson, or his name was Hillel Koch, and he called himself Peter Bergson. He was the new leader of the revisionist Zionists, taking over from Jabotinsky. And he has this idea that the only way we're going to save the Jews of Europe and then establish a Jewish state in Palestine is to assemble a Jewish army. So he was very, very militant. And he was disgusted that the word rescue never, ever came from any Allied leader. Roosevelt never talked about rescue. The media were not talking about rescue. He started to put rescue into the vocabulary. And so on one side you have this militant right-wing Zionist, but very committed to saving the Jews of Europe. And then at the same time you have the ultra-Orthodox leaders. There had been a rescue committee called the Vad Hatzalah, organized by the Union of Orthodox Rabbis in New York. And they talked about, they listened to Wise at first. They were willing to keep quiet, and they believed that Roosevelt had their back. And then the voices started getting louder, and they were very frustrated. Where is the talk of rescue? So 1943, you have these 2 distinct groups. The ultra-Orthodox, for the most part, almost all, not all, but most of them were virulently anti-Zionist. There's this idea that they were anti-Zionist because you can't have the state of Israel until the Mashiach comes, till the Messiah comes. That's a little bit of a myth. A small faction did believe that, but mostly it was about the secular socialist nature of the Zionist leadership. They didn't trust them. If you were going to have Israel, it had to be religious. And these secular Zionist Jews, Ben Gurion and company, were very secular and even anti-religious. So they were anti-Zionist. There was also a faction of religious Zionists, smaller faction. So you had this militant Zionist, Peter Bergson, on the one hand, and these ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionist Jews. They came together on the most unlikely pairing. They get together. They have a common enemy. And so Bergson comes up with this plan. If he could get 400 bearded rabbis to march through the streets of Washington, people will have to take notice, the media and the White House. So this is what happens. October 1943, suddenly 400 rabbis march through the streets of Washington to the Capitol and to the White House. So it's quite an unlikely spectacle in those days. And it's also treason, or that's how it's portrayed in some sections of the American community and the Jewish community, because you do not criticize Franklin Roosevelt, this beloved figure, and besides, you're undermining the war effort by criticizing Roosevelt. But they didn't care. They wanted to put rescue on the agenda. So one day, 400 rabbis, and they march to the Capitol, and they sing the Star-Spangled Banner in Hebrew, and then they head to the White House, assuming that Roosevelt will have to meet them. But meanwhile, Roosevelt's advisors have told him, these don't represent the best elements of Jewry. Just ignore them. So Roosevelt slips out the back door of the White House and refuses to meet them. But fortunately, there was a camera crew, a newsreel camera crew. The media mostly ignored this march. There was a camera crew that followed them. And so a week later, Americans, when they went to the movies, saw on the newsreels this incredible spectacle. That finally put rescue on the agenda. And Roosevelt was forced. This seems to be the key event. Roosevelt was forced to finally start talking about rescue, and soon afterwards he establishes the War Refugee Board, dedicated to the rescue of European Jews. So it's a pretty important event. So meanwhile, this is late 1943. By that time, go back to Europe, the Nazis were losing the war. The writing was on the wall, it was inevitable, Stalingrad happens, and most of the German high command know that the end is near. It's only a matter of time before the Allies invade Europe, and that will end the 1,000-year Reich. So that brings us to this other key player in the saga, Heinrich Himmler. Heinrich Himmler is the head of the SS, and the man that we know today as the architect of genocide. Himmler is the Nazi figure that Hitler has entrusted with the logistics of the final solution. And in some ways, Himmler was even more evil than his Führer, than Hitler. Himmler is the guy that before the final solution even started, when they were slaughtering Jews in the Soviet Union, they started by just killing the men, the Jewish men. Then they added the women. And it's Himmler that decides you have to kill all the children as well. Because if you don't, one day they're going to take revenge for the murder of their parents. So Himmler, not Hitler, orders all the children murdered. So he's a pretty evil figure. And he's known as the architect of genocide. But Himmler is a little more pragmatic than Hitler. And he's surrounded by people. He's also very powerful. Most intelligence estimates, most Western intelligence estimates are, at the time, they're saying that Himmler is probably more powerful than Hitler because he commands the loyalty of the SS, basically the entire police apparatus, which includes the Gestapo, and large elements of the armed forces. So Himmler at any time could have decided to overthrow Hitler. And they're starting to blame most of the German people and the military and key elements of the Nazi party are starting to turn against Hitler because Hitler has led them into this morass. He was a beloved figure, and now he's leading Germany to its doom. So people around Himmler start to counsel him, you've got to overthrow Hitler, you take command. Himmler has this pathological loyalty or fear to the Fuhrer. So this is a non-starter with Himmler. But he also has people around him that are talking about a separate peace. The only way out of this mess is to establish a separate peace with the Western allies. So the idea, or sometimes it's called a compromise peace. So the idea is that Germany will enter into an alliance with the United States and England and turn against their common enemy, Stalin, and wipe out Bolshevism for good. Himmler hates like a lot of leading Nazis, hates the communists almost as much as he hates the Jews. So this starts to have appeal. We see in his diary and letters, various correspondence, that Himmler is open to this idea of a separate peace. And it starts to take hold. So this, the Germans know that they're losing the war, and they are also out of currency, hard currency, to buy the military materiel that's necessary to continue with the war effort. So this leads to these various ransom ideas. We'll release Jews from the concentration camps in exchange for money. Various sums are bandied about. Even Hitler has authorized this. And the Allies have labeled this as absolutely unacceptable. Any ransom, any idea of ransoming or paying the Nazis will just further the war effort, and therefore is illegal, it's trading with the enemy, and it's absolutely off the table. So the Allies rule it out. And these ransom efforts don't really come to anything. And so the only sort of exception are the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox. So the ultra-Orthodox, in Judaism in general, the highest commandment there is to save a life. And, going back to the Dark Ages, you do anything to save a life. You ransom, you bribe, anything it takes. So the sort of even the underground Jewish leaders are stymied because these various ransom efforts take huge amounts of money, and that's basically what brings them to a halt. They cannot raise the kind of money the Nazis are demanding to free Jews. But the Orthodox answer, and getting back to Resha Sternbach, the Sternbachs especially, they answer to a higher set of laws, right? So they're willing to ransom. And so one of these ransom efforts, so this brings us into 1944. The Americans have established the War Refugee Board because of the Rabbi March, and the only real block of Jews left in Europe that the Nazis haven't turned their attention to are the Hungarians. There's almost 800,000 Hungarian Jews, and suddenly the Nazis invade Hungary. And finally the world sort of takes its head out of the sand and realizes that this is dire. And, Roosevelt issues these stern warnings, and he starts to talk about the Jews for the first time. Before, he would always talk about the persecuted people of Europe. So now the Hungarians are warned against cooperating with the Nazi extermination efforts, and Auschwitz starts to sort of reboot, and they're preparing for the remainder of Hungarian Jewry. And so they firm up the operations, and they're preparing to basically murder the last 800,000 Jews. So this is where a new ransom plan takes hold. Adolf Eichmann, who's been entrusted by the Nazis, by Himmler, to put in the logistics of the final solution, is very efficient at this. Very quickly deport and exterminate large amounts of Jews. Eichmann's given the order or the task of liquidating Hungarian Jewry. So there's a Hungarian underground rescue operation that's empowered to negotiate. They know that the Nazis, word has got out that the Nazis have been willing to free Jews for ransom before. So you have a guy named Rudolf Kastner, who becomes the key negotiator with Eichmann. Just before the Nazis are ready to deport the Hungarian Jews, Eichmann tells Kastner and Joel Brand, another Hungarian rescue leader, that he's willing to stop the mill at Auschwitz. He's willing to blow up the facilities at Auschwitz, basically stop the exterminations, in exchange for trucks, first trucks. They're desperately need trucks in working condition on the front, and that's a non-starter because the Nazis have forbidden trucks. Then the German people are starving. The Allies are bombing Germany at will. They're targeting bakeries. They're targeting food production to try to starve the Germans into submission. So they switch their demand from trucks to tractors. Okay? In exchange for tractors, they will stop the exterminations. This is Eichmann. So it's, again, a non-starter. It's illegal. It's trading with the enemy. Meanwhile, the Sternbucks hear about this, the tractor ransom. Tractors happen to be one of the key exports of Switzerland. They had contacts. There were tractor factories. And their ears perk up. They have money. They have access to funds from various Orthodox efforts, and they have money coming from New York, from the Orthodox rabbis in New York. And so they decide to finance this tractor ransom on their own, without telling the Allied authorities, without telling the War Refugee Board. They're going to buy the tractors that are going to stop the exterminations, free the Jews. So they start to maneuver. They try to raise the money for the tractors. They need money for 400 tractors. They raise the money for 40 tractors. That's all they could really raise. Even that's a lot of money. But 40 tractors is still something. That would be the first real concrete ransom that the Nazis have asked for and paid. So, meanwhile, the Sternbucks hear about this Swiss politician, a man named Jean-Marie Musi. 1944, in the summer of 1944, Jean-Marie Musi had been a sort of a centrist president in the 20s and early 30s, and he wasn't particularly right-wing or fascist when he was president. He was a little bit anti-Semitic, but no real indication that he hated the Jews. But he was a very staunch Catholic. And the Catholic Church at the time had this virulent hatred for communism, for Bolshevism, for Stalin. Stalin had wiped out the Roman Catholic Church in the Soviet Union, was turning his attention to the Russian Orthodox Church. And so communism was the primary threat to civilization and to Catholicism. And Musi's a staunch Catholic. His wife's father is a papal count, and he's very, very devoted. And he decides, after he leaves office, he's a lawyer. He's a very, very prominent lawyer, but his sort of hobby is anti-communism. He buys a newspaper and turns it into an anti-communist propaganda rag. And he travels to Germany and gets Nazi financing for anti-communist propaganda. And so he establishes these ties with the Nazis. He never really embraced the racial ideology and the anti-Semitism to any large extent, but he certainly shared their aversion to the Bolsheviks. So this is his sort of his entree with Himmler and with the Nazis. And then he's also a lawyer. So in the summer of 1944, Musi, a couple that are his clients, they they had relatives, they're Jewish, and they had relatives in a German concentration camp. And they knew that Musi had these connections with the Nazis. They go to Musi, and they ask him to free their relatives, the Blochs. And Musi agrees. He never really agreed to act on behalf of the Jews before, but I guess these were pretty prominent clients, because he agrees. So he writes to the Germans, and he personally drives from Switzerland, it's not a very long drive, to Paris. They're in a French concentration camp, and they give him this couple, and on the way out, he says, the SS chief tells him, never before has an Israelite entered a German concentration camp and come out again. So this is pretty big. He drives them back personally to Switzerland. The news spreads. So the Sternbucks had continued their operations, their rescue efforts. They've been incredibly successful. But, saving a few thousand Jews pales in comparison to what was happening. Millions and millions of Jews were slaughtered. Resha Sternbuck was in despair, needless to say. And she hears about this Swiss politician that managed to free Jews and had links to Himmler himself. So Resha and her husband Isaac traveled to Fribourg, Switzerland, to the estate of Jean-Marie Musi, and invites them in. And Resha says to him, and she's a very powerful force. First of all, you have to, by 1944, Resha has established a rescue committee in her house in Montreux, Switzerland. She had by this time moved to Montreux, Switzerland. And there are photos, you can see them in my book, the photos of Resha, an ultra-Orthodox Jewish woman, surrounded by men at her dining room table. This is the rescue committee. And they're just listening, rapt to her every word. So she had a pretty strong force of personality, needless to say. And so Resha sits down in the living room of Jean-Marie Musi, and she says, Herr Musi, we are both servants of God. The Nazis are an affront to everything we both believe in. You must help my people. And inexplicably, Musi agrees. So Musi agrees to send a letter, a cable, to Heinrich Himmler requesting a meeting. So this brings us to October 1944. This is when she meets Musi in mid-October 1944. By this time, there are still 200,000 Budapest Jews that the Nazis haven't yet got around to deporting the Budapest Jews. Most of the other Hungarian Jews have been sent to Auschwitz and exterminated on arrival. So Musi's letter is answered. Himmler agrees to meet him. So in early November 1944, Musi travels, meets Himmler's train on its way to Vienna, gets on with his son Benoit, who drove him, and he sits down for the first time with Himmler, hadn't seen since before the war, from anti-communist circles. And he has prominent ties with the Nazis. He knows how their minds work. And he sits down with Himmler on this mission. And he tells him that he's been sent by the Grand Rabbi Sternbuck. Sternbuck wasn't a rabbi, but he really pours it on. And he's working on behalf of the Union of Orthodox Rabbis in New York. And it's as if he had been anointed by the learned elders of Zion themselves. And Himmler believed, he knew that Himmler and the Nazis believed that the Jews had the year of Roosevelt, and Jews are pulling Roosevelt's string in the White House, and Himmler still clinging to this idea of a separate peace with the Western Allies. And this is the only chance. By this time, Himmler is desperate for this separate peace. And so Musi tells him that he's working on behalf of these rabbis, these very powerful rabbis, and that the Allies are open to the idea of a separate peace. So this is a deception. This is absolutely non-starter. This was never, ever going to happen. The Allies had always made it clear they're not negotiating with the Nazis. They'll only accept an unconditional surrender, and they're not going to turn on their ally Stalin. Himmler doesn't know this. And Musi, who cuts a pretty impressive figure, he's a former president of Switzerland and a staunch ally in the crusade against communism, Himmler seems to believe him. He tells him that the Allies are open to a separate peace, but first you have to end the genocide against the Jews and stop the exterminations. So, to his surprise, and we have the contemporary correspondence at the time, Himmler seems to agree. He's open to the idea of freeing all the remaining Jews in the concentration camps. And he's still, at this time, so this is November 3rd and November 4th, 1944, he's still talking about the idea of hard goods. He needs trucks or tractors or medicines and hard currency. And this tractor ransom was still in play. And the Sternbuks had raised the money for 40 tractors. The Nazis had been demanding 400 tractors to destroy Auschwitz, to stop the exterminations. So this all comes together at the same time. November 1944. This is November 3rd and 4th, 1944, that Musi meets. And they had the agreement to buy enough money to buy 40 tractors. They still needed a permit. You needed an export permit from Switzerland, from the Swiss government, to send the tractors out of Switzerland to Hungary. The Germans wanted these tractors in Hungary for their agricultural cooperatives to grow food, to feed the military, to feed the German military and civilians. So they have the tractors, they have the money, they don't have the export permit, but they're negotiating. The bureaucracy is working overtime, and this is where I come in. So I spent a long time researching and pouring through archives, hundreds of thousands of documents on three continents. And like I said, I spent a lot of time immersed in the Orthodox community, the ultra-Orthodox community, the Haredi community. And I come across the archives of the Vad Hatzalah, the Orthodox Rescue Committee in New York, the rabbis, the Union of Orthodox Rabbis. And it's ensconced in Yeshiva University in New York, in Manhattan. And I spent a lot of time in these archives going through the cables that had been sent. The Sternbuks had access. Russia had befriended the Polish ambassador in exile in Switzerland, a man named Alexander Lados, who was very taken with her, and offered the rescue committee access to the Polish diplomatic pouch. So whenever they wanted to send correspondence to New York, it would go underneath, under the radar of the prying eyes of the Allies. So whenever they had something secretive, they could use the Polish diplomatic code. So these letters are sitting in the archives of the Union of Orthodox Rabbis, and I'm pouring through them. And fortunately, they're in English because it's the common language. The Sternbuks spoke English, mostly German, but they spoke English. The rabbis in New York spoke English. The Sternbuks, interestingly enough, they're ultra-Orthodox. They didn't speak Yiddish. So otherwise, these would have been in Yiddish. It would have taken a lot more time to translate. So November 4th, 3rd and 4th, Musi meets with Himmler. Himmler agrees, but he's still seeking, hard currency, ransom, a little bit of ransom, at least to cover himself with Hitler. And so on November 20th, we have receipts. The Swiss government finally issues the export permit, copy of the export permit, to send these tractors that the Germans have been asking for. Meanwhile, these Orthodox underground leaders have lied to Himmler. They say, we have the 400 tractors that you're looking for, and they're on their way. And so these 40 tractors that the Sternbuks had secured, they're just sort of the first shipment. The Nazis are still expecting they're thrilled. This is the first time that they've had any significant ransom. And this is a pretty important ransom, these tractors. They're desperately needed. So on November 20th, the export permit is issued. on the same day, I find a series from that week of correspondence between the Sternbuchs in Switzerland, the rabbis in New York, and on November 20th, the Sternbuchs send the rabbis a cable about their delegate Musi, informing them on the progress of these talks, Musi's talks with Himmler, and they say, the first one says, our delegate has received a promise to cease extermination in concentration camps. Okay? November 20th, 1944, the Nazis had promised to blow up the facilities at Auschwitz. It was the last remaining death camp, and stop the exterminations if they got their tractors. Tractors are coming. November 20th, export permit is issued. The Germans are told. Tractors are on their way. There's proof. Same day, Musi has secured a promise to cease exterminations. 2 days later, there's another cable from the Sternbuchs to the rabbis saying that the Vatican nuncio, the papal nuncio, the ambassador in Switzerland, has received a promise that the murders will end. November 20th, November 22nd. 3 days later, on November 25th, 1944, the extermination apparatus, the gas chambers and the crematoria at Auschwitz come tumbling down. The Nazis dismantle, dynamite, disassemble. It's the end. Formally, the end of the final solution takes place on November 25th, 1944. The formal, systematic extermination of European Jews. So many more Jews die and are killed after that date. This is the end of the systematic extermination, the final solution, November 25th. On the same day, Rezo Kastner, the underground Jewish leader in Hungary, is shown an order from his SS contact, an order from Himmler, dated the same day as the gas chambers are destroyed, saying that forbidding the further killing of Jews. So this all comes together at the same time. Same week, practically the same day. Himmler orders the end of the forced marches from Budapest. You have the Germans have started to forcibly march. They're not yet called death marches. Forced march out of Budapest, and Raoul Wallenberg. We know about Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat that saved countless Jews. This is what he saved them from, these forced marches, so they're pretty significant. Himmler orders. All this happens practically the same day. Gas chambers and the crematoria are destroyed. The forced marches come to an end. The deportation of Hungarian Jews come to an end. That's the end of the Budapest Jews are now effectively safe. They're not really quite safe yet, but so if you look in any history book, and I'm a historian, if you look at a Holocaust history book about Auschwitz, every single one will talk about the killing apparatus came crashing down or was dismantled in November 1944, but they all say the same thing, the conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom says that the Germans destroyed the killing apparatus because the Russians were coming, because the Allies were near, and they wanted to hide the evidence of their crimes. Safe conclusion, they always did that before. They always destroyed the death camps before the Allies arrived, mostly before the Russians arrived. But in this case, the Russians were still 2 months away. This never made sense. There's no evidence. There's not a single order. There's nothing in Himmler, nothing, saying that the Nazis destroyed the death camp, destroyed Auschwitz killing apparatus because the Russians were coming. But this is the conventional wisdom. So the Russians are still 2 months away. When the Russians finally arrived 2 months later, we just celebrated the anniversary last week, they found more than 7,000 Jews. That a couple of days earlier, the Germans had marched out on the death march more than 50,000 Jews from Auschwitz to Germany, but they left behind 7,000 Jews, eyewitnesses. Elie Wiesel was there. We all know Elie Wiesel. supposedly they were too sick to march, these people, and they left children and teenagers. Why would they do that? Never made sense. The great Israeli historian Yehuda Bauer in 1974 told Yad Vashem, the first symposium on rescue. He said to the delegates, this doesn't make sense. It would make more sense that the Germans would have hastened the extermination process. They could have easily killed the remaining 7,000 if they wanted. Why would they leave them behind? Never made sense. But that's still to the conventional wisdom to this day. So these documents that I found, they represent the first, concrete evidence linking the end of the final solution, the end of the destruction of the Auschwitz apparatus, to these negotiations, to these secret negotiations. So they're pretty significant. So that takes us to November 1944. There's still a lot of Jews left in the concentration camps. And so this sets off, it's too much for me to go into now, but the last 6 months of the war is incredibly dramatic. You have Himmler still clinging. He still believes. It's very clear he believed this till the end. He believes this idea that the Allies are open to these negotiations because time and time again, he ends death marches and he ends systematic exterminations. There were rogue commandants that established their own mini death camps for a time in certain camps. But Himmler seems committed to this deal. Musi races back and forth several times to Germany. He secures a trainload of Jews from Theresienstadt as part of these negotiations. And then Hitler finds out. Hitler's henchmen have told him that Himmler has negotiated a secret deal to bring hundreds of his own henchmen to Switzerland sanctuary. And Hitler's furious, and he forbids any further releases of Jews. And so we head closer and closer to V-Day. The Allies are descending on Germany, and Hitler knows the end is near, but he's determined to take every last Jew down with the Reich. And he orders the destruction of the concentration camps with the Jews inside, dynamited or poisoned. And his henchmen, especially Ernst, his security chief, Ernst Counterbruder, actually orders the destruction. We know that there was dynamite found and poison found. And Himmler countermands the order, or Himmler also allows the Red Cross. Very little has been, very few people know this, but the final months of the war, Himmler allowed the Red Cross into the remaining concentration camps to distribute food and medical supplies, but only if they agreed to remain until the end of the war. So these Red Cross figures, but two in particular, end up basically saving the remaining inmates by discovering that there was poison. There was a plan to put poison in the food of the Dachau inmates and dynamite in the caves of Mauthausen. So hundreds of thousands. We don't know exactly. Nobody knows how many Jews survived the camps because the Nazis' once meticulous record keeping was destroyed. But we do know that on the night of April 20th and 21st, Hitler's last birthday, Himmler meets just outside Berlin. Hitler's birthday party is taking place in the Führer bunker. Hitler's preparing the cyanide capsules. He knows he's going to kill himself. Everybody knows he's going to kill himself. And Himmler secretly meets with a member of the World Jewish Congress, a Swedish Jew named Norbert Masur. So while the high command is meeting in the Führer bunker, Himmler slips out, meets for 2 hours with this Jew, a high-ranking Jewish official, and because Masur and the World Jewish Congress has heard that the Nazis had planned in the last days of the Reich to destroy all the remaining Jews in the concentration camps. Masur travels to Germany. Himmler agrees to meet him to plead with him to countermand this order. And he does. Himmler, we have reports on both sides from the World Jewish Congress that he secures this promise. The next day, the very next morning, Himmler leaves the estate of his Finnish osteopath, where he's met with this Jewish official. He goes straight to meet with the head of the Swedish Red Cross, and he asks hours later, he asks this Red Cross official, Count Bernadotte, if he has contact with Eisenhower, because he wants to surrender the remaining German forces on the Western Front, only on the Western Front, not to Stalin. So all this takes place in the last week of the war. Hitler finds out about this. Until this point, Himmler thinks he's going to replace Hitler. He knows everybody knows Hitler is about to kill himself. Himmler is his chosen successor. We believe, historians believe. Hitler refers to him as der loyal, der true Heinrich, my faithful, my loyal Heinrich. Hitler finds out about this offer that Himmler's offered the head of the Red Cross, German surrender on the Western Front. He's furious. He orders Himmler arrested, excommunicated from the Nazi Party. He sits down and writes his final will. We have it. We have the final will and testament. He writes a will and then a political will and testament where he orders the arrest of Himmler. Basically, the execution of Himmler. It never could have happened. Himmler was much more powerful than Hitler at this point. But this all takes place because of these secret negotiations. Yet, how many of you have ever heard this? I'm a Holocaust historian, and until I came across this story, I had no idea that this had all taken place. Very well documented. So there's a lot more to the story, and there's a lot more figures. There's a lot, I sort of distilled it to some key figures in my book, but there's a lot of heroes in this saga. But as a result, there's 300,000 to 400,000 European Jews survived the Holocaust, and and Resha Sternbach has never really gotten the credit for her part. So, as you say, this is one of the rare, very inspiring stories of the Holocaust, and it deserves to be known. And I'll leave it at that.
Do you have any questions?
Yeah.
The question is asked if we go back into it.
So.
Repeat his question after the audience.
Okay.
I'm trying to speak up. I read your book cover to cover
Okay.
for the footnotes, but I was a little unclear as to Himmler's motivations for engaging in all these negotiations and activities. For one thing, they weren't realistic, especially the tractor portion.
Right.
Any farmer can tell you you don't plant in November, and even if you did, you wouldn't harvest that until, well, they didn't know when the war was going to end, but they knew it was close.
Yeah.
They wouldn't harvest any food until long after the war was over.
Okay. So.
Was Himmler working on behalf of himself because he feared punishment for collaboration with this, or was he working on behalf of Germany to try and work out this separate peace?
So he asked about, for anybody who didn't hear, he asked about Himmler's motive for these negotiations, and especially the tractor ransom didn't really make sense because it's November and the harvest is only going to be in the spring. So to answer the first question, it's very difficult to discern the motives of madmen. Right? We do not know Himmler's motive. We do know that he was surrounded by people around him that were urging him to take over, to overthrow Hitler, and if not that, then to establish a separate peace. We do know that he believed that a separate peace was possible, and the Allies, Musi, and the Sternbachs, and others cultivated this delusion very effectively, because we do know for a fact that Himmler, up until his last days, even after he was not appointed a successor, he still seems to believe that he is going to be the successor to Hitler, and that he's going to, magically engage in this separate peace. As for the tractors, the theory is that Himmler didn't really care about the tractors. He needed cover with Hitler. he couldn't tell Hitler that he was negotiating a separate peace, because Hitler was absolutely against any sort of negotiations. He just needed something. He needed to show Hitler that this was going to help save Germany. They're starting to pay our ransom, and we're going to get our tractors and eventually our war materiel to turn on. So that's just an educated guess. To this day, we don't know.